I'm just actually, it's a question for Bernd. I just was really interested that you felt that perhaps part of we are part of the problem, this idea of the creative industries, jobs, growth being cited as fast growing. Now, I think it's absolutely fascinating because actually just a couple of weeks before we put out our Brexit report, we put out a report which said the exact opposite, which was called Social Mobility and the Skills Gap. And it was actually about the fact that we believe we have an extraordinary opportunity for jobs and growth, and particularly if the UK education system was perhaps a little less marginalising of creative subjects, an extraordinary opportunity to actually, for some of the disenfranchised, less academic, elite children, to actually give them extraordinary opportunities in the future. And I'm talking particularly because we are a sector that's growing very fast, and the fastest growing bits of the sector are a lot where there's a combination of creative and technical skills are required, which is in that animation, visual effects, film side, where actually you can be incredibly practical skills. You don't have to be academic necessarily to thrive in those jobs. That we actually view, if we had the right infrastructure in place in the UK education system, we view that we're a massive opportunity to open out to others. Anyway, I just wondered if perhaps it's completely different in Germany, but I was just interested to know.
Well, I would agree on the perspective that this opportunity is there, but still it seems to be that a lot of those values and opportunities are not being taken. If you look at those voters, of course there is no analysis in depth, and in Germany you have a dual education system, as you might know, where you have a lot of practice into it. And in this question raised of the social divide, so to speak, of the social drift, which is putting our values outside of part of the society, might be also a digital divide, because a lot of the growth and opportunities are connected to tech and creative industries and creativity, and not all those people, the how do you say it? Disenfranchised, is not about digital. Yeah, it might be more about the maker generation and the 3D printing thing, but it might be also a feeling of the intellectual milieu. I think we just need to take a new perspective on it and ask new questions. And I also might add, for example, that in Germany the calculation and the numbers of what is creative industries is significantly smaller than yours in UK, because we did not the redefinition of creative industries as you did in the UK. So our perspective on creative industries is different as well, and I'm just surprised, seeing in Germany and Austria and many other nations that despite the fact that we have so fantastic economic numbers, even on the national agendas, the creative industries is not so high. Yeah, it's somehow as, we are playing this song of our economic success, and people just don't listen to it, strangely enough. And so I'm really enthusiastic to hear that that you say you manage, and your aim is to say creative industries will not be overheard. You cannot do without it. I wouldn't say this in Germany. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Of course, I'm not specialist in the UK stuff, but one of our member organizations there, the Law Centres Network in the UK, they provide advice to citizens directly. So at the meeting last week, they actually announced that, yes, no matter that the UK is one of the richest nations in a way in the European Union, actually the social divide, or the divide between rich and poor people, have been increased dramatically over the years during the crisis. And she mentioned, I do not remember the figures by heart, but it was something like this: a ratio, rich versus poor people, before the crisis was 1 to 40, I think 7, if I'm not mistaken. And now, after the crisis, it has increased to 1 versus 150 something. So I was wondering whether this, because it's a dramatic increase in my view, whether this is something which is felt also in your sector in some way.
I mean, it's something obviously that in the UK we are acutely aware of in the divide. And I mean, Brexit, I mean, this is one of the things, this isn't a federation point, but this is a point that, you know, I think it was only 62%. What the turnout was? I can't remember what the turnout was. 67%. I mean, it was a very high turnout. The point is actually there were still a lot of people who weren't even engaged at all. I mean, it's actually, you know, it's not just 52% who felt disenfranchised. There's a whole load of people who weren't even enfranchised enough to vote. So we need, I mean, it's an enormous challenge, and there are massive issues. Now, I mean, all, you know, as a sector, we do worry. I mean, I think it's fair to say we do worry that we are sort of talk to ourselves as an echo chamber, and you know, we are slightly self-congratulatory about the fact that we should be able to reach out and make these things better, but we're evidently not. And it is a big conversation. When we went round the country and we went and held these sessions in various places, most of the places we held sessions were places that had voted to leave. And these arts organisations feel very marginalised and uncomfortable and upset by the fact that they are obviously not connected with the society that they felt they had connected with. So we hope we might be able to help in finding a solution, but there are so many social issues connected to it. With really a tiny drop in the ocean.
Can I come in on that? I think it is definitely, it has always been an issue. There has always been a white middle class cultural sector in the UK, and there will always have been a fewer audiences. It's always been more difficult to engage kind of outside of that for the cultural sector. I think it's absolutely right. The cultural sector particularly is very good at talking to itself and not very good at talking to that public. And that has just become even more obvious in this vote. I think what is lacking for particularly the kind of those non-white middle class people who voted in kind of Brexit, the Brexit voters, the disenfranchised parts of the country, is that for them, particularly because of the economic situation, the idea of a cultural future, a cultural career for their children, for their families, is just not on their radar at all. But the cultural sector is guilty at not putting forward the right role models, I think, that actually demonstrate that there could be a career, or there could be positive advantages to having a career in the cultural sector. And some of what you were talking about before in terms of the types of roles that are available. But actually just speaking more broadly than that, it's just not something that we're very good at doing, and I think we have to get better at.
Yes, sir. Can you say who you are, please, and where you come from?
I'm Joaquin de Santos.
That's super.
Joaquin de Santos from the European Group of Industry and Heritage. It's a EU network of industry and heritage tourism. And obviously we have a number of members in the UK who are also very concerned with what is happening. And I would have actually a question to our British colleagues. I wonder, I read in the news a number of reports about universities feeling that they were being sort of like sidelined of the EU projects because somehow, sort of like other European partners feel that there might not be a reliable partner in the future because of Brexit. And I was wondering if this was also something that you noticed in the cultural creative sector, that sort of some of your members were also feeling that they had sort of lost this relationship with their continental sort of like peers, and also sort of were being sort of like left outside of the board and putting together projects.
Can I, before you answer that, can I just illustrate that a little bit more? So the university sector in the UK created a website called Universities for the EU, and on day one they asked all of their academics to log anything which in any way was presenting a step or a problem. So somebody who might have chosen against taking up a research post or a project where they would have been a partner, but now suddenly that was more difficult. So there was, particularly in the university sector, there was some quite considered research done there.
Yes, I mean, certainly because we have education institutions as well as cultural members. We heard some of those stories. It helped that the UK government agreed to commit to the sort of remainder of these programmes. So I think at the beginning there was quite a lot of uncertainty. That some of that has gone away. But what we're hearing is some UK institutions and cultural organisations feel unable to take the lead role in some of the fundraising because they feel the uncertainty over the sort of long-term future of some of these projects is a worry. And actually in our report, I think it was probably the saddest story that I heard, which was in Plymouth, which is a city in the UK which is incredibly, I mean, it has terrible issues with unemployment, with very, very low educational attainment. It's sort of fallen off the map a bit. And they made a very, very big strategic decision in Plymouth to focus on two core industries, which are the marine industries and the creative industries, as part of their regeneration of the city. And it all leads up to the Mayflower 2020 sailing celebrations. And one of the projects within that was a Creative Europe project, where they got together with 11 other port cities in Europe who were also looking at cultural regeneration. And they were going to lead the bid to pull together these cities. And it was part of their kind of putting, as they called it, Plymouth would become an international waterfront city. And part of it was this culture project. And their leaders in Plymouth felt after the vote that they were unable to take the lead. So they dropped out of the bid and they never went forward with it. Now I think it will be resurrected by another leader, but that's the example of one of the areas we heard about.
I think the concern and the issues which Harriet brought up earlier around funding in terms of European students to the UK and UK students to being able to get access to courses and Erasmus courses and things in Europe is quite an important one for the kind of long-term health and I suppose kind of diversity of the sector. We know from our survey that we think probably around about 8% of our membership came originally to study in the UK and have stayed to make a career there. And there are a large proportion of students each year that are coming to take part in UK university or higher education or art college courses. And without that kind of mix, that kind of melting pot and interest going on within our art schools, I think that the sort of learning experience of both UK and EU students is going to suffer. It's not going to be as good. But it will have a knock-on effect financially to the institutions as well. And I think it's fair to say that UK higher education organisations have been under pressure for some time. They are very popular, they're very good at what they do, but you'll know it's probably the same across Europe. The sheer business pressure to keep delivering, to be at the top of league tables and to administer those institutions is getting more and more. So I think anything which is going to have a knock-on effect to that is going to have serious consequences to teaching, to the kinds of courses that are on offer. And we already see that there are a number of arts courses that are disappearing. The knock-on effect for our sector, and particularly in art colleges and higher education departments that are offering visual arts, is that is also usually a part-time area of work for individual practitioners who are quite often working part-time. They're teaching, they're lecturing, they're mentoring as a way of supporting their practice. And as education sector gets kind of pinched in all sorts of those sort of related areas, that also has a knock-on effect for practitioners too.
Jill, is there anything that you would add to that?
Well, not from the cultural sector particularly, but certainly the fear that there has been with universities and the uncertainty over how, not that they'll lose funding that they have now or partnerships they have now, but that people won't be confident enough to establish partnerships in the future. But But I think certainly in Wales, the university sector has been very active from day one. They are very well represented on the board that's been set up, the committee set up to advise the Welsh Government on leaving the EU. And we've also had very successful projects, for example, through the European Investment Bank. And so it's important for us to identify projects like that, which still will be available for sectors after we've left the EU, if we are outside the EU. There are several funding schemes and projects that we can still be members of. And so I think we need to be ensuring that is made very clear, that wherever we can be still part of something, we will be, such as Erasmus Plus, for example. So that there is a positive role to play in that, but certainly there is a nervousness about the future, of course.
I can share our experience, which is quite diverse, because we have very, very strong legal component in our work. We have been running for more than 3 years now a new rights clinic, which was a joint venture between us, ICAS, and the University of Kent in Brussels. And now we know that they have decided to withdraw from this partnership, because simply what they intend to do is to phase out their studies here in Brussels after, in view of the Brexit.
And they are a UK university that call themselves a European university, don't they? That's a core part of what they do.
This is very sad. On the other hand, we have received a request for partnership from the Sheffield University, which actually apparently are adopting just the opposite approach. They said, you know, we want to maintain and even to strengthen our links with Europe. So therefore now we are establishing a structured cooperation, so interns there will be visiting our office regularly, at least 4 times a year, and we'll be working with them together in order to assess some specific impact of the Brexit of certain EU rights. And we are going to launch a Brexit observatory together. So it's really very, very much different, and I think it depends on the intention of the university itself. Otherwise, because also we advise our members on EU funding, I know that UK is, I think, the second in the European Union biggest absorber of funds for research and innovation. So therefore, I think that it will be a great waste if the access of the UK to those funds actually ceases. And it will be a loss not only for the UK, but also for Europe, because we will lose all the capacity and the expertise and the knowledge that has been accumulated over the years. I believe that if the UK government actually agrees to cover the cost of the participation of the UK in those programs, it will be great, because those programs actually are open to non-EU countries as well. So, provided, of course, that the government cover the cost of participation.
I have two people with questions here, but I wanted to just quickly bring in Christoph here, because I'm hoping that he's going to give us some intelligence on what the UK government might or might not be doing.
Yeah, yes, some of that as well. First of all...
say who you are, sorry.
Sorry, my name is Christoph. I look after the Creative Europe Desk UK. I have a lot of heritage here in Brussels, so I'm very much at home here as well. Creative Europe Desk UK, which is a partnership between British Council, where I work, and some colleagues here today are from as well, the British Film Institute, and all of the UK's devolved arts councils. So they all contribute to making Creative Europe Desk UK function, and we're a little bit bigger than most other Creative Europe desks because we have a little bit more of a mission, I like to think, than a lot of other more basic Creative Europe desks. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. A point of information, actually a message of reassurance disguised as a point of information. You just mentioned it, but the Erasmus Plus program, Creative Europe, a lot of these programs are open to non-EU member countries as well. Creative Europe covers 39 countries. It may well also cover Israel from the 1st of January. Most Western Balkan countries are part of it. Norway, the list goes on and on. It's a very big program, just like Erasmus+. So yes, there may be a wish, a will, a desire, and a case to be made for the UK government to wish to negotiate its way into some of the more softer, some of the more human programs in order to smooth conversations about harder EU programs. UK universities are one of the most present universities across Europe in the Creative Europe program. They are big beneficiaries of the Creative Europe program because that's how many UK universities work. They work with artists, they run creative projects, they are practical. So there's a huge take-up in Creative Europe by the higher education sector, and I think the project you were talking about is with UAL and a gentleman called Nicola Dorigo.
No, it's
No?
actually
Center of Europe.
Industry and Heritage. It's a
Yeah.
EU-wide network, which is also financed by the Creative Europe.
Yeah, that's right. The UK is also the second largest benefiting country of Creative Europe funding. So the money case has been made. The UK, because we need to think of this in a very transactional way, gets more out of it than it puts in this specific program. But what is more important than, I think, the money, and Harriet, you mentioned this very much, it's the softer effects of this program. The UK is the most partnered country in Creative Europe's cooperation projects, where 70% of the funding goes. There are more UK organizations in all of the partnerships that are supported through Creative Europe. We can talk about the reasons for that, but we are incredibly involved in that side. Reassurance. The UK Treasury, which is the Ministry of Finance, has guaranteed to underwrite all successful Creative Europe projects that continue beyond an exit date. Creative Europe is still an incredibly, I'll put this the other way around. UK-based organizations are still very, very eligible to apply as leads and as partners to Creative Europe. So if anyone is getting cold feet, that I think will be based a little bit more on fears than on facts. And we all do need to look at longer term and medium term planning. But I think the other side of this is an incredibly valuable time to refresh our conversations, to really build on relationships and go for partnerships and go for funding, because what is uncertain is the longer future. And for Plymouth not to have wanted to lead on that application was their, I think, city council's choice rather than the development company who was actually going to put in the bid. So we are offering messages of reassurance, of opportunity, and I hope that's been a little bit useful.
I'm just wondering whether there's any other examples out there, just whilst we're on it. One of the things that came to mind, Christoph, when you're talking there, was the capitals of culture, for example. And the UK is lined up for, or was lined up to have a capital of culture in 2023. It's still not too late. We have 2 weeks or something. Because a lot of those cities that have been preparing it have been doing quite a lot of work already to get themselves into that shape. Right, I have a couple of questions, so I'm going to move it on. The lady at the back there with the white scarf.
Yes, Marie-Laure Lullet, Epicenter, consulting company in Brussels based on culture and arts and media.
Hello.
I'm about funding. I go on this funding issue because there is a concern at the moment with structural funding, which is at the moment vis-à-vis the data and the number of millions that are supporting cultural-related projects through the regional funds. There is a real concern that the money will be no longer available, and that this will impede the sustainability of cultural-based, media-based projects on the long term. Long term for me is 5 years, 3 to 5 years. So do you, so far, do you have started to evaluate, to assess this impact on your business model? And that's one question. And second, if you've done so, what are your options in terms of substitution of funds, knowing that the UK fund, whether national or regional, are not there because the European fund was searched because the UK fund were not there. So remember that, it's, historically speaking. So I don't think this will change in the next 5 years. So what are your options vis-à-vis this extra funding needed in the future?
That's an incredibly valid point, and actually there's a whole section of our document on exactly that, because it isn't, I mean, Creative Europe funding is very important, but actually the stories we heard as we went round about actually the ERDF funding that has gone into the sector, and ESF funding, and there's, I mean, I can't, we put a list together and it was sort of 30 different funds that people had benefited from. And the trouble is that they are all administered through different departments in the UK. They then are administered at a local level through a LEP, which is the local authority levels in the UK. And there has been no way of tagging what money has gone where and has been spent on what in a really forensic way, which is a massive issue. And it's a particular issue for our sector because we thrive on a mixed economy model. We thrive on its public funding, its commercial revenues, and its sponsorship and philanthropy. And so much of that European money has gone in to help. And actually a lot of it is infrastructure as well. So actually it was up in Newcastle. We held the meeting at the Sage Gateshead, which is a huge cultural venue in Newcastle. Now that was only made possible because ERDF funding was used to clear the industrial toxic site on which it was put originally, that then enabled the Arts Council and the Sage big sponsors to come in and have that building built, and it's now an extraordinary cultural venue. So we are desperately trying to get that funding sorted out. We've written to Treasury, which is the finance ministry in the UK. It's been raised in every single meeting. I've raised it today in Brussels as well in meetings I've had, wondering whether centrally in Brussels there is any way that we could track even. It'd be interesting to know across all the EU how much money from those, whether they've got anything, say actually culture has received X across the whole of the EU. It's just so we can show how important it is for the sector. So we are doing a lot of work on that because we want to be able to claim our piece of the pie when that money, in theory, comes back into the UK.
In our survey, we did ask artists whether, you know, if they knew whether they had benefited from EU funding in the last 12 months and to what extent. And 30% said that they had had some kind of EU funding. 10% said that they didn't know. And I suspect that actually that figure, both figures, are probably much higher in reality, because artists are quite often down here in the kind of spend. They're being commissioned. The commissioner will have received some sort of EU funding, but is passing it on. And considering the range of situations and contexts where artists are employed out with exhibition settings, they're being employed in health settings, they're being employed to deliver environmental projects, to do social engaged practice, to all sorts of kind of environmental or public sort of space work as well. All of the areas where we know that EU funding, ERDF funding are being funneled. Now, that's been funneled there because local authorities have not had that money to do that kind of work for many years, and they certainly don't have it now. The Arts Council doesn't have it now. So, yes, visual artists and artists generally, individuals who are generally in receipt of that kind of cash are stuffed, really. I think it's not looking very good. I think what the policy makers have been kind of pushing gently for quite some time has been resilience, sustainability. But of course, for a lot of sectors, and particularly some where there is no direct route to market, you're used to being represented by somebody, or you're used to being a recipient of funding. It's a huge cultural shift to move from being a recipient to being a proactive entrepreneur, going out and finding business and selling work and selling services around what you do, around your practice. So I think there's going to be a huge kind of business and cultural change that has to happen within the sector as well to deal with that.
I have a direct question to this. This does not only concern the creative industries, but many other sectors which are much, much larger than the creative industries. Do you team up in the advocacy work towards the UK government? Because as I understand, as long as there is a net profit, UK government would pay certain amounts of money into the European funding to get it right back. So,
Can you answer that, Jill? Is that something that you have a...
Yes, there is, well, for us in Wales anyway, I know there's quite a detailed breakdown of what's spent where, because Wales is actually a net beneficiary of EU funding, because 3/4 of the country gets the top level of convergence funding. So for us, the loss of that funding in the longer term is going to be a huge problem, and not least because of the arts. And we were talking earlier about the poorer, disenfranchised communities. That's, of course, where most of the money goes. And many of the projects in those areas are arts and cultural projects working with young people. And so there is a big impact. But I think as well as the regional funding and the social fund, there's also the other funds like Interreg, for example. We have a lot of cultural projects with Ireland, between Wales and Ireland. And so we need to look at the whole range of funding. And that's why it's so important that we actually prioritise those things which are most valuable to us. We want to keep right across all sectors. And it's going to be a huge evaluation of the impact of European funding on our communities, and something which has been done, of course, in recent years by the EU, by the European Commission, not by the UK government. And so we're entering into new territory here, but we certainly have to be making very, very clear demands, I think.
Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Can I just add, I think in terms of models or learning from other sectors, I think possibly the cultural sector has something that it could learn from the science sector, particularly in terms of looking at how we might work together or learn from each other in terms of how you access funding or continue to access funding for research and development. I mean, obviously that's a huge issue for the science sector, but actually for the cultural sector it is as well. Artists have to have money to be able to develop their ideas. That's already, and has been for some time, has been under a huge amount of pressure to be able to get your hands on even a small amount of money to develop a piece of work. So there are probably other sectors that we could be learning from to find out how we can do that better.
Certainly we've had initial conversations with the science sector and the tech sector, because actually if you look at the 4 areas that came out of all our meetings, they're almost identical in terms of, high need for freelancers, lots of tiny small businesses, dependent on various pots of innovation money, etc. So that those 3 sectors, we are quite aligned actually, and there will be a point, I think, it would be much more useful if we can come together and make our lobbying points, whether it is on how the new immigration system might work, as 3 sectors with similar needs, rather than all going in separately with slightly different asks. So certainly it's an important point to consider.
Are there any more questions from the floor? I wanted to come back to something earlier, but it's quite a big question, so I'm slightly scared of it really, but I'm maybe going to go for it. We've seen this rise of populism, we might call it, internationally now, and perhaps the discussions around these numerous votes that we're seeing being against an elite or an establishment. I'm hearing quite often, though, this conflation of this notion of elite and intellectual, or elite and academic. Indeed, as part of the campaign in the lead up to the referendum, one of our politicians kind of informed us that it probably wasn't necessary to listen to the intellectuals, that we had to feel what we felt. Just wanted a reflection on that, really, because as the cultural sector, we are probably much more towards this thing called the intellectual or perhaps the academic in this story. So the notion that actually some of this was a vote perhaps against us. And what are we going to do about it, I guess, is the question after that.
Shall I start? Because as a politician, it certainly was a vote against us. And yes, it's not easy to explain the vote in the referendum, I don't think. There were so many different reasons that all came together for different people. But certainly there was some very clear trends. One was a reaction against the establishment, which probably does include intellectuals and the cultural sector together with politicians and the government and so on. And I don't think we've really yet begun to have the dialogue that we need to have with people in those communities that feel so sidelined, so disenfranchised that, as you said earlier, a lot of them didn't vote at all. And a lot wanted to make a protest. They wanted their voice to be heard. But we haven't really had that dialogue yet. And it's something that we all need to address very seriously, of course. And all working together, right, across all of the sectors is certainly not for one single group to address. But it's something that we have to do quite quickly. We have to look at the way our democracy has worked or not worked, the way that we elect governments, the way that we don't involve people properly. It's one thing having a in or out vote on a massive question, but was there a real engagement? Was there a real discussion with those people before the referendum about the real choices that were in front of them? I would say that in Scotland there was a year of real debate before the referendum. We didn't have any of that, so we have a huge amount of work to do to put that right.
Peter, please.
I was reading one small article in New York Times on the artists aligning with Hillary Clinton in the election campaign against Donald Trump. Because if you look at those images where Beyoncé or Madonna was sharing a stage with Hillary, the people that voted for Trump just said, well, but of course you're part of the elite. If not, you would not be on stage, because I could never be on stage with Hillary Clinton. So a vote for Trump was also a vote to, let's say, this cultural actors being on stage with Hillary Clinton. So I think the backlash that we're seeing in Britain, in the United States, in France, Germany, the Netherlands, is very much also a backlash against us, traveling, talking about a subject like this in a beautiful building like this. It's very worthwhile. I think it's very important to do so, but I think it's almost more important to, and I don't know whether we should be calling to involve people in these discussions or to listen to them and involve ourselves in their discussions. And I think what we as European Cultural Foundation are trying to support, if we're supporting this young European change makers, is exactly supporting these people that develop an idea that we are able to grant by inviting them to an idea camp and then follow them for 1 year, seeing what they are doing with an idea that is not their idea, but is mostly come about by people talking to them what is their idea. And I think if we extend the notion of culture to a broader sense of culture like this, we might be having a different conversation on culture in a year from now.
Thank you.
You were first, but
I was first? Okay. I agree with you, but I think we need to see a wider context also of the media, which is developing and changing, while the the images of culture used to be produced by a certain professional group of media people. Today we have the education of media in the do-it-yourself manner. Everybody is a media producer today. So a lot of opinions which might have been there 10, 20, 100 years ago are now relevant in public media and might be a bigger public voice than the professional New York Times. So I believe that the view of the cultural sector, of the artist engaging with the public has to see that he is mediated in a different way, and that he might have to be a much more mediator himself than he used to be, and not just let this happen by so-called professionals or by the public themselves. Yeah, we need to explain ourselves in quite a new way, and maybe even in new languages. We just had a workshop with artists about the kind of formulas and languages we write, which they use to apply. Yeah, because it's down to this level already, that you have to talk on this level. What kind of languages are you using to communicate how to apply for funds? Already there, it's different languages.
Thank you, Bernd.
I think that on a general note, very many citizens are not happy with the way in which democracy is practiced nowadays, not only in the UK, but in the entire European Union and beyond. And actually people want to be listened to between elections as well. The question is that you have to arrange this in a responsible way. It's not possible that you never ask people for 100 years and all of a sudden you put to a referendum, which actually the specialists said that it's not a referendum because it does not satisfy the main requirements of a referendum, such a question of geostrategic and political choice which will impact generations ahead, not only of the UK, but in Europe and in the world. Yeah? It's not like electing politicians. Electing politicians is very important, but still, you can correct the mistake in 4 years. What we are now going to experience will have a huge impact. And I believe that these kind of decisions, if put on a referendum at all, should have some kind of a safeguards. For example, at least qualified majority. Yeah? You have to be sure that at least the majority part of your population wants that. Otherwise, it simply becomes a very easy, prey. All the citizens become a very easy prey of not well-intended politicians which are looking for short-term gains. So, unless direct democracy is part of the tradition of the country and is played well and in a responsible way, I think it shouldn't be practiced otherwise, because it simply gives a wrong impact.
And I just want to pick up on that. I think it's also important to see that at least in our democracy in Germany, we have a strong evaluation of minority rights. Now, when you say Brexit is Brexit, you ignore like 48% of the population in UK. So I think if you go back in time, you would find a more balanced approach, of taking the whole population, even if you are the winner. Yeah. And if you see the situation in the USA as well, yeah, it needs like a tiny percent to win in order to claim the domination of the big minority, which is almost the majority. So this is also a cultural change in policy, which we would need to address. Yeah? If we talk of openness, fairness, cultural values, a democratic winner should not act like this. He should act inclusive. Democratic winners of today don't act exclusive. And we need to address this.
I think one of the hardest things that we're dealing with, from those of us who voted Remain, you might be surprised to hear that that's what I did, is that we need to now shut up. That we need to, that the country has chosen, that this decision has been made, and we need now to stop complaining and to stop whining. But as you rightly point out, it wasn't so huge a difference, and in many places it tipped the other way. Christoph.
Just a bit on numbers. We were asking about the turnout. The turnout was 72% at the UK's EU referendum.
that represents a leave vote of 37% of the total electorate, those who could have voted, and that represents only 26% of the population of the UK. And within that, you need to count those who were disenfranchised, who were not citizens, but let's say a couple of million EU citizens who contribute, pay taxes. You went through all the things that do. So you have that's been discounted as well. So yeah, it's not. I think it's difficult to say the will of the people and the people have chosen.
That also includes people from other countries, living in other countries who voted.
Yes, I think Irish citizens were allowed to vote, and from New Zealand, was it?
Are there any more questions from the floor? Okay, I might. Yes, no, go on, sorry, I didn't see.
It's just by curiosity, because I recently noticed that in some sectors, not the cultural sector, not the art sector at the moment, not the media sector, but in other sectors, or professions like lawyers, they are now moving from the UK, and they set up companies in other countries. And I wonder, it's just a question, I have no clue about data about this, I wonder to what extent the UK may lose a part of its cultural media workforce in the next 5 years to other countries. I'm not talking about continental Europe, but other countries would mean maybe US or Australia, New Zealand. I mean, people that are able to work in Anglo-Saxon or English-speaking countries, for sure. And to what extent this would have a considerable effect on the future investment made in the country in our sector. When people are leaving, you know. Returnees or this type of.
Well, I mean, certainly it was raised, particularly obviously in our London meetings. I mean, if you look at the architecture sector, for example, I mean, we are an international giant when it comes to architecture. One of the reasons is also professional qualifications have equal standard across the EU. Now, if you have different professional qualifications, if they develop at different speeds, actually, does it become right to all your architects to be based in London when actually it might be better? I mean, Rotterdam has done the most extraordinary job of becoming an architectural hub. You've got Berlin, who is brilliant at filmmaking. I mean, obviously that is something that we really do definitely worry about. I mean, it's a huge cause of concern. I mean, on the Today programme, the big news programme, this morning, the French, somebody from the French Stock Exchange was talking about the fact that a number of the big US banks have already been over to Paris doing their initial scoping. We've heard from lawyers about some companies who are looking at, you know, if there's no, it's about the country of origin principle and broadcasting, and actually, you know, if there's no certainty over that, given sooner rather than later, should they move some of their activities to Germany? You know, it's certainly people are thinking about it, and obviously it's a huge threat to our London, particularly London and big city, Manchester, Birmingham, big creative companies.
There's also, again, anecdotally, a number of stories of those who are reclaiming a different European citizenship, because many of the countries will have an allowance that says if your grandparent was from Ireland or from Cyprus, in my case, or somewhere else, then you can therefore claim that other citizenship. So that's another conversation that I don't know that there's any data on, but it's certainly being discussed quite a lot. Okay, I'm going to ask you all now to give us some parting wise words on just maybe one thing. What can we do? What can we know nothing. We're in a complete void. Those that are supposed to know nothing. But what can we do? I'm going to start with you, Jill.
Well, I suspect my answer is maybe easier than the other panellists, because for me, in my position as a Member of Parliament here and on various committees at home, what I need is information, facts, figures, all of the arguments that you want us to put forward. And I will be doing everything in my power to influence the negotiations that are going to take place after Article 50 is triggered, and before then, of course, at home. So for me, it's information, it's knowledge. Please email, write to me, whatever. This is going to be such an important 2 years that we can't afford to let anything be missed. So bombard me with as much information as you can, and I promise that I will raise those issues wherever I can.
Thank you. That's great.
Well, I take your question as a request for a wild idea. What can you do upside the usual? I think
because I think it affects us all.
That's what it's about. I think in order to increase your negotiation power within UK government, it would be good to do something really visible about the value of European funding and European exchange. In Germany, you have almost the whole population, 60 million people, going to museums every year. So why don't just close museums, theaters, libraries, close the sector just for one day. Just don't open it. Don't use anything which is used and funded by European Union. Close the bridges. Just try it in order to make a really visible statement nobody can oversee. It's something you can really do. It's hard to imagine.
Closing the bridges might be slightly outside of our control. Thank you.
I think, there have been a number of ideas and suggestions, from the floor, people mention things, and I think it is really about sticking to those basics of collaboration and communication, and making sure that we are putting forward the right stories and the right role models and the right case for culture as we go forward. And I'm actually quite optimistic at how some of those conversations can go, because I've been working with some of our artists and seeing some of those conversations as they happen. And you'd mentioned about are we evaluating them? I think that when we're putting money into some of the bursary strands that we're going to be doing over the course of this year, I think it'll be really interesting to see how artists have that conversation, how artists who have a completely democratic position, they're not affiliated to anything, they can go out there working in communities, they're working with the public, they're working with their peers, they're working with children, all age groups, to see the kinds of conversations and the kind of solutions that the public can generate and the artists can generate too.
I think one of the things that this is my first day in Brussels in about a year, and I think from a policy and a lobbying perspective, we think as a sector, as a country, we were so shocked by Brexit that we really went in on ourselves, and there's been a lot of, in navel gazing, as we say in English, a lot of looking at ourselves and our problems and wondering how we can get the best out of this, and I think that actually is wrong, the wrong way to look at it, and that we need to start talking to European colleagues, counterparts, networks, engage better with the Commission and MEPs going forward, because actually I think it's going to be a much healthier outcome if we can do it thinking across Europe rather than just thinking about what's in it for us and what do we need. So I certainly think that as a sector, we need to be coming out and being more present and more visible and talking more with people like yourselves. So, thank you.
I would say to remain positive and optimistic, because if you can see how actually the imagination of those people provoking the no vote had quite an effect, because it happened. It could also mean that if we are optimistic and willing to work hard for a possible Remain vote, if we were to do it again, would have also been possible. So there is really this power of imagination to make things move, and make things move that have endurances for generations. So I would say stop whining and really start working. Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, from my perspective, there are three issues. First, with regard to the UK, I think we have to unite forces in order to try and strike the best possible deal for citizens. And this is what we are trying to do with partners. We are going to have now similar discussions in Gibraltar, London, and also Dublin as first next couple of months. The second moment is, as an European association, I think we have the obligation to put some more efforts and make sure that another Brexit doesn't happen. Never. And third, one of our three focus areas of ICAS, in addition to EU rights and digital democracy, is beyond the EU. So whatever the result is and whatever happens, we will continue working with the UK because of everything you guys represent individually and as a country and as a capacity. Europe needs you, one way or another, in one shape and form or another.
Thank you. I'm going to bring the session to a close. I have an observation that I think I'm going to make here, which is, as the UK, I guess we've always felt that we were perhaps somehow on our little island somewhere. But what this past year has shown me, ironically, that we have been more European than we have ever been before. And there are now so many doors open for new ways of working and new partnerships that people might just not have thought about before. So actually there is opportunity there, there is chance. This thing called Europe that we are all part of, that we didn't really think about, we're now really, really thinking about it. And there is a renewed Europeanness about the Brits now that perhaps there wasn't even just a year ago. I'm going to bring it to an end. I want to thank you for coming. Thank you so much. For Bozar for hosting us in this most splendid place. For the ECF for partnering us on this project. Thank you very much. And to you, the panelists, thank you very much indeed.